Hello and welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host Benjamin Wheeler and I'm here with Anthony Marquetta to talk about books. 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 Specifically books we're reading this month, and not too many other books. Um, I've got a couple. Anthony's got a couple, and we're just going to go through them. Anthony, why don't you start us out?
So let me. Do you want me to talk about the eighth arrow? So try and build hype.
We'll do that at the end.
Okay. That's so. I will mention right now. Cough, cough. The eighth arrow is my favorite thing that I've read, fictional book especially that I've read in a very long time. So, and we have a surprise associated with that for later. I will talk about the other fiction book that I read first, and I did finish it, so I can talk about it in some depth. It is called The Hiker's Guide to Purgatory. So, leaving aside the Catholic philosophical background, theological background that is needed to accept the book as like a genuine. Let me think of how to put it. A genuine speculation about theology. I want to be clear here that I don't think that that is necessary to enjoy the work. I don't accept C.S. Lewis's conception of, the in between heaven and hell that he uses in The Great Divorce, and The Great Divorce is one of the most profound books that I've ever read. I suspect, though I'm not 100% sure, that Lewis also does not believe that his view in The Great Divorce is exactly what the afterlife will be like, or would even, be in that ballpark. So, The Hiker's Guide to Purgatory. The plot of the story is that the main character has died and is in purgatory, which is envisioned as a sort of giant national park where you need to reach the mountains at the other end, and the mountains symbolizing heaven. And as you go, you work through your various issues from life. Again, I'm going to work under the assumption that whether or not this is a valid theological speculation is not relevant to its quality as a work of fiction. Uh, in Catholic theology, I think that the intention of the author was that would be a valid theological speculation, and as far as I could tell, I guess it is. But I don't really, that that honestly doesn't matter to me much because I wasn't reading it as a work of theology. I was reading it for insights into the afterlife, your relationship with God, your relationship with your fellow man, how
Excuse
you
me.
work through those issues and things like the Great Divorce did. So, full disclaimer, I thought that The Hiker's Guide to Purgatory was an okay book. I did not love it. I did not think it was bad. There was nothing offensively wrong with it. With that said, it suffers a little bit in my mind in that all books about, that period in between heaven and hell, that the afterlife where you work through your issues, that sort of story I compare to The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. The Great Divorce is straight up my favorite book. Uh, I'm not saying it's the best. I don't even think it's Lewis's best book. I don't think it's the best book that I have ever read. Like it's not Lewis's best book. It's not the best book that I've ever personally read, but it's my favorite book. I found it profound. It is the only book that I've ever read that made sense to me how like small sins can keep you out of heaven or things that you I shouldn't put it that way. Things that seem like small sins to you could potentially keep you out of heaven. It's the only thing that ever made sense of that concept to me is Lewis's The Great Divorce. The Hiker's Guide to Purgatory did not have the same impact on me. I did note that there were allusions to a lot of different things in there. There was definitely allusions to The Great Divorce. Lewis envisions his kind of purgatorial between heaven state as something like a gigantic field also leading up to mountains, and the mountain imagery is also present in J.R.R. Tolkien's masterpiece Leaf by Nickel, which is one of the finest short stories of the 20th century and is on a similar topic. So, to get into the background of what I think this book did do well. I think that envisioning purgatory in this well does make sense as a concept. A sort of like, you have to literally work your way, right? It makes visual the idea of literally working your way through the hang-ups that are keeping you out of heaven by visualizing it as a hiking trip. I guess that my problem, such as it is one,
I played the
is
video game. Yes, yes.
I'm confused.
There's a video game that basically does that exact thing.
Oh, is there really?
Yeah.
I guess it makes sense. Um, so yeah, nothing wrong with the idea, I suppose. I guess my problem with it is that I don't think the book did a good enough job of making the connection between the hike and the working out of issues. So what happens in the story is that you sort of flash back through this character's life and you see like, and to be clear here, I have no issue with any of like the character's backstory or how he got there. Like, he was the idea is that like he grew up in an abusive home with an abusive father and a mother who wasn't abusive exactly, but kind of gave up on God because of how his father treated him. And he was a playboy when he was younger, and he cheated on his wife, and then, his wife left him, and he has a come to Jesus moment, and he returns to God, and then eventually he reconciles with his father, but his mother dies before she can properly convert. But his father also converts, and becomes a Christian, and he reconciles with his father, and then he dies. And like they mentioned that the worst thing that he did in his life was that one of the women that he had was having an affair with got pregnant, and he suggests to her in a moment of like fear and desperation that she get an abortion, and then he gets contacted later that the child was taken care of. And you learn, they leave it ambiguous for a little bit, but you learn relatively quickly that it was not an abortion, it was a miscarriage. And then he meets the child that would have, been born in Purgatory. And I think that's a cool idea. Like, I like,
Yeah.
I don't hate that concept.
It
But
seems
there
kind
was
of
something.
like a cop out to me. But it's like
In
I
what
guess
sense?
so. Like first off, let me make sure I'm not muted. Okay. So it's like this. If that's the worst sin he's done, which is to suggest something, and then he lives his life as if it had happened, or at least a portion of his life as if he had murdered it. But it turns out, oh no, it feels like he doesn't have any major sins. Then he
Oh yeah,
has
I mean, you didn't read the book to be fair, so but I would say so. I'll put it another way. I wouldn't say I disagree because you need to read the book to properly agree or disagree. But I would say I did get the impression he was like a very, he was a flawed person who had returned to church and tried to do the will of
right.
God. Is the way like I do think the book gave that impression. Like I'll give it
Okay.
that credit.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Uh, I guess what I didn't really like is that a lot of it was just him working it out in his head slowly, and then he sort of and I'm like the hike as a metaphor doesn't really work with just working it out in your head. Like it
Right.
seems like it's two different things that aren't. He didn't do enough to me to properly connect it. And I wouldn't say it was bad. Like I don't think the idea of working through it like as a concept, it does make some sense to me, but I do think that he definitely should have made it either more abstract almost, to be honest. Like
Right.
it was almost too literal. Like like he was literally working through it like in his mind. That's like, okay, so why are you on a hike? Like I
It's
don't
a
really get it.
metaphor.
Right, but the metaphor is side by side with him actually working it out. You know what I mean?
It's a metaphor.
Uh, I also, this is again like it's kind of subtle, and it's less so much that it was that the book was this bad, is that like I wished it had done more. I didn't really like. Uh, I didn't really like what he was doing with the prayer to the souls of purgatory, and it it struck me as a very shallow idea of what prayer could do. Because the idea was that they would pray for people sometimes, and then it was almost like they got a spiritual battery boost. Like they were waiting, but then he started praying, and then it's like, oh, your prayers had a direct effect. like, yeah, okay, I do believe that prayers have an effect, like, and this isn't just a purgatory on anyone,
Yeah.
like on people, but the effect isn't like from you to them, like it's through the medium of God, you
Yes.
know. It just, and I wouldn't call this necessarily like, I'm not accusing him of, saying, oh, God's not necessarily there, but there's something that's missing.
Mm-hmm.
There's something missing there in like what prayer is doing and the effect that it's having. You could even see, like, honestly, I think there's a kind of a missed opportunity, because you could see if you leaned more into the metaphor angle of it than what he did. I feel like you could have this image of like angels coming and helping the people and going like, he prayed for help for you, and I'm here as your traveling companion. You could even have him have a companion there. It's like, so why are you even here for me? Oh, you were prayed for. Like Amy, who's the name of
Yeah.
his miscarried daughter. It's like Amy was praying for you, so they sent me to help you on your journey, right? Like
Yeah.
something like that. And yeah, I don't think it works exactly like that. But I think as a metaphor, it makes more sense than just like prayer gives you like a battery boost
Yeah.
almost. Uh,
Like
so overall, would I
it's part of the struggle. Like in a very real sense, prayer is part of the struggle of the Christian. Both against things and for things.
Yeah, so ultimately what I would say is like, would I recommend it? I don't think it's bad. I think that there's definitely something to the idea in this genre, and it is a little kind of a mini subgenre. Uh like in this little subgenre of like, people dealing with their spiritual issues in the in-between sense.
Yeah.
It is not my favorite work in that regard. Read The Great Divorce first. I think, if anything, The Great Divorce is less theologically accurate, but it is more profound. The Great Divorce made things make sense in my head that did not make sense before I read it. It honestly was like a mind-blowing book for me. I have a chat question. Simon Hogwood says, I picked that up recently too and am loving it. Do you mean The Hiker's Guide to Purgatory or The Eighth Arrow? Because I mentioned both early on. Just when you have a chance, if you hear what I asked, drop in and mention it. Cordell Mitchell says, gentlemen. Hello, Cordell.
Mental Jim.
You're always going to be one of our favorites because you pay us.
He would. Don't listen to Anthony. You'd be my favorite even without paying it. Not really.
Not really, but it's okay because you do pay us. Ben, you're up.
All
Give
right.
your book review.
So, I'm reading much less spiritual things, but I guess I'll start off with a sort of spiritual one. I guess I'll start off with Bronze Age Mindset. Uh, I've read it and I'm rereading it, or will be rereading it very soon. And it's interesting to me because I understand and can consume very little theology or philosophy. I can hear it and it works pretty well for me, but to actually kind of listen, to actually read it is very difficult for me. I don't know why. I think it's a medium thing. But basically, what will happen is that I will kind of just lose track of the aphorisms and ideas put forward. But the thing is that most of the philosophy that was written either, in Nietzsche's case, as a warning for the world to come. There's a reason why men without chests is such a theme in future sci-fi and whatnot. John C. Wright's Count to Infinity series definitely hit that off pretty well, where you have the patricians who are these like ubermenches, and then you have the men without chests who are their clients, the plebs. They don't create, they don't really expand, they're not patricians. They're nobody and nothing. And I kind of view us in that society. I work with men who are more manly than I am. But their experiences of life are much more shallow. They are not spiritual men. They do not read. It's kind of a mocking thing. Oh, Ben, why do you read? Oh, I say I'm a big fat nerd. And they go, you ruined it. I was going to call you a big fat nerd. I'm like, ha! you think I've done this before, and I turn it into a joke again. Um, and it's very haunting to me. I know that most people are not going to be Christian. Even people who go to church are not Christian. I'm at peace with that. It's why we should witness. Um, but to me, I don't want to live a life without vitalism in it, without a soul. I cannot be an artist if I don't burn for something. I don't believe in cold artistry. You don't paint pictures like Guernica, or melting clocks, or the water lilies of Monet, or all the Renaissance painters, but they're Italian, so they burn in the best of days anyway. Uh, like without having this strong basis, this strong fire within you. And I'm searching for that. Not for myself. There's a part of me that's burnt ever since I was a kid. It didn't dissolve, even though life definitely tried to break down a lot of what I am. It preserved me, and I view it as entirely God given. Our souls are God given. Whatever people say about what animates what within the body, the full picture of ourselves is incomplete without the soul. So what I do is that I find that a lot of Christians are just not writing about being vital within the world, having energy, fighting, you know, sort of sort of being larger than life. There's an aspect to humility. I serve at my church, and it's just a humble thing. I set out chairs, I roll out some tables for the Sunday school. That's it. I do other things when I'm asked, but if you're, it's there's no like pursuing eldership. I've even said I really don't think leadership is for me, but it's it's beyond that though. There are times to be a servant, and then there's times to be a leader. But what can you do in between? So the thing with um, Bronze Age mindset is that it pulls out, tugs at these ideas that create a vital spirit within you. And a lot of that is fairly ridiculous. He talks about how terrible being in the Chinese hive mind must be, and all this other stuff. But then he also talks about, you know, how he once saw a bouncer, and I bounce on the weekends, sigh, and he realized that the bouncer had the same sort of issues that other people had, that he himself was bored of life, even though all his job was kicking out people and ogling pretty girls. Not that I would understand that experience, mind you. So he actually pushes the bouncer away. And of course, who knows if this is true or not, but the man's crazy, so I believe it. Uh, and he gets beaten in an alley for his trouble. And he says, "Yes, this is power." And you sort of like, it's an affirmation of life, is what it is. Even though he's being beaten in the street, he was imperious to the bouncer and disrespectful, and the bouncer took his proper due from him. Um, and this might sound very strange, but like if you've never worked as a bouncer, you don't get it. A bouncer has a universal eye to everything going on around him. He is not a part of the world. He's not a part of the bar, right? You see where I'm going with this. But he has to protect the bar. Now, that involves throwing people out, keeping people out of the bathrooms and stuff like that. Throwing out people who are too drunk, and maybe even guarding the door. But to do it, you have to have a certain amount of will to beat back these people who want to just serve themselves and never actually want to think about the consequences of their actions. It turns out a chick who seemed very lucid, but she was actually pretty high apparently, because one of her friends, who was a friend of mine before all this, told me. gave out her number to so many guys, including me. Um, and I thought it was very funny that it's like, she didn't respond to any of them because she was embarrassed because of the circumstances. I like to think of quite a few other things. Me and T both had the experience with this one guy who had these dead eyes. And this man had clearly seen some garbage in the military. And he even admits it. He won't say what it is, fair to him. But, he saw some stuff. And both T and I, even though we are civilians, I've never been in the military. I don't think T has either. We just basically said, yeah, dude, even if you're not 21, you can drink. You've earned it. Because of the soul that was in him could be seen through his eyes. And a lot of Bronze Age mindset is these weird, inane ramblings about how he hates the longhouse, how he hates to sit and squat and be feminized, and all these other things. But he also recognizes that greatness is not for every man. But he also has these ideas that are just not compatible with life. He doesn't believe man should work hard because he rightly recognizes that working hard is a representation of sin. Man, Adam, had to live by the sweat of his brow. We live by the sweat of our brows. I literally sweat. Um, I sweat so much at my job. It's insane. And I'm at a warehouse. It's like you can see the salt marks on my undershirt, um, just because of how much I sweat. It's a real thing. But he desires the Faustian infinite grasp of Western man, but he doesn't desire the Faustian infinite workload that it requires. The moon shot required an immense amount of labor, back-breaking labor. Men had to sweat and produce that steel. Men had to put it together. Men had to risk their lives creating the fuel. And it was men all the way down. Though, remember, guys, there were some black women too, double checking the mathematical equations, apparently. Oh, you can't forget that. But it goes through it. And I recognize that Bronze Age mindset is not for everyone. It's really not for most people. But it's for people who have a yearning, who seek something more. I am unsatisfied with the era I live in. I'm unhappy with it. I'm unhappy with everything I've seen. And I think that's part of the reason why God put me here. Because if I was actually happy, I'd be a lazy bum. Um, but I'm not a lazy bum, so I guess it's working. Who knows? And I'm always concerned about am I doing something for this? Am I working God's will here? If I was put here for by God's will, what is His will for my life? And some of that means I doubt myself. Some of that means I make very terrible decisions. I don't know why. Anytime I brag on Pinkerton's ghost publicly, something bad tends to happen to me or somebody around me. I don't know why. I don't know if it's nemesis or if I'm going about it the wrong way. But I gotta brag on Pinkerton's ghosts, otherwise we're not getting advertised. But I can't have our audio editor get sick again. Pray for him, by the way. The and there's a whole lot of other stuff to it. Maybe it's just chance and circumstance. And it just happens to mingle together so that me, a pattern seeking recognition guy, would uh would see a pattern that isn't really a pattern and go for it. The spiritual nature of things for the non-Christian is different than from the Christian. And so if you want an idea of the non-spiritual nature of man through a position of somebody who is certainly schizophrenic, it's a way to sort of glimpse into it without being burned yourself. You're not going to be some sort of crazy Russian academic who's uh, bullying the local bouncer for reasons that got him beat, you're just a normal dude. But the idea that we can sort of pursue this fire that is the central soul of ourselves and dedicate it to God, like Hannibal dedicated to the revenge against Rome, we can dedicate ourselves and our works to God, never to be a friend of the world, and to even leave behind men like Bronze Age Pervert, as magnificent as they are in the world's terms, and pursue that holiness for in exchange the fire of a passing flame of glory for an eternal fire that will never be extinguished. Anyway, that's Bronze Age. That's my review of Bronze Age mindset. I hope it confuses you as much as it confuses me.
Is it recommended?
It is a solid recommend, with the caveat of it's weird, and you probably should start with something easier like Sun and Steel by Mishima.
I getcha. So, as I was going through my Kindle library to try and remember like what was the last few books that I read, and because like everything I read is on Kindle now, I am unashamed and unapologetic about this. And I actually forgot a fiction book that I did finish, so there's a third. It is by, I do not know this gentleman's real name, since I am sure this is not it. H. Albertus Bully. Ben, have you ever heard of Bully's Celebrated Magazine? Dr. Bully's Celebrated Magazine?
I have not.
I'm going to give you a link to it because I think you might find it amusing.
Please.
So this requires a little bit of background to explain. So Dr. Bully's Celebrated Magazine is a satirical magazine put out by somebody who calls himself H. Albertus Bully. And he has a very, very, very weird blog, essentially, with a series of satirical, old-timey articles and pictures. And if you have the right sense of humor, it is quite funny.
But I don't have the right sense of humor, Anthony. What will I do?
Probably not for you, then.
Oh.
Now, I enjoy Dr. Bully's Celebrated Magazine. And I discovered that he actually had several books. Some just like compilations of his magazine or extended versions of his magazine. Some novels. And one of his novels is known as The Crimes of Galahad. So,
Ooh.
curious by the summary of the novel, I decided to pick it up. And I read it within a couple of days and thought it was pretty good and worth talking about. I may make a review of it for the Castalia House blog. The concept behind the novel, I personally believe, is quite funny. So the idea is this. The main character is the self-proclaimed wickedest man in the world. This takes place sometime in the 1800s. I forget the exact years that they give, but, just think like 1800s America. Like Allegheny, Pittsburgh, that area, yeah. Anyway, and the main character's name is Galahad, though he hates that name and prefers his middle name, Norman, because Galahad's such like a goody two-shoes name. And his father is an extremely good man, a small business owner. He runs a store, but he's an idiot, and the son hates him, and he hates his sisters. Forget their name, Violet and Camilla, I think they're called. He hates them, and they're just nasty to him for, like, no real reason. He says that Violet is just genuinely nasty to him, and Camilla does whatever Violet does, because she's an idiot, and both of them are dumb. And the story is about how he overcame his weak father, his weak, dumb father, and his idiot sisters, and his, upbringing in a Christian school that like abused the students, would beat the students, to become a highly successful businessman and the wickedest man in the world. there's something weirdly profound about the book, though, that, like, it's hard to explain. Now, you could immediately see the satirical value of the book, I hope, right? Like,
Yes.
the idea, as you read the book, it becomes very clear. The book is called The Crimes of Galahad, and I am pretty sure that Galahad does not commit a single crime throughout the entire book,
No, he's
which
a
is the joke.
worldly perfection. Yes.
Right, which is the joke.
Yes.
So the idea is that he almost kills himself one day when his father changes the name of the store. His last name is Boasted, Bousted, but there's also, of course, the joke that it's Boasted, right? And he changes the name of his store from Boasted to Boasted and Son. And this brings him into such despair that, like, will I only ever amount to the son of a shopkeeper, that he considers killing himself until he spots, I forget what exactly it was, but some sort of, like, medical, jar of, like, some sort of mild medicine. And then he realizes that that jar of medicine is probably made the person who made the medicine incredibly rich, and that as a shopkeeper, he can make himself a captain of industry. So he decides he's going to devote himself into turning into a captain of industry, and he nearly gives up again. He comes up with a method of matching somebody's handwriting to their to a certain thickness of paper purely by accident. Like, I think that there was somebody who was being really nasty and rude about, like, her handwriting ripped through the paper, so he sells her cardstock. And the cardstock, of course, doesn't rip through, and they go, "You're a genius. You should turn this into a method." And he's like, "Yeah, actually, I think I will." So he turns it into a method of, like, matching your handwriting to a certain thickness of paper, and it becomes known as the Boasted method. But he nearly kills himself again until he spots a review of a French book. And he said, "I had never read the book, and I don't think it was ever translated into English because the States refused to publish it. But the review, which was a negative review, told me everything I needed to know about the book." And they said, and the book was about somebody who claimed that by all rights, men should be wicked. That, properly speaking, you should try and always do what is best for you and you specifically, and nobody else. That everything that you do should be with the goal of furthering yourself, and if you are the superior man, it will make then every decision you make should be to put yourself in that higher position. So, reading this review changes Galahad's life. He immediately dismisses the objections of the reviewer that this is, wicked nonsense, as, like, the reviewer's clearly one of the unenlightened. For this man, this Bocher, I think his name was, has figured it out, and I am going to start living my life in this way. But of course, the joke of the book is that every decision that he happens to make over the course of the book that leads to a better outcome for him is somehow also benefiting everybody else around him. So he says, I needed to consider what to do. Like, I expanded my method and I simplified it for more people to read, because I knew that if I did this, I would be able to sell it in more stores and it would be easier to hire people and I would make more money. Right? And
Right.
I could try and push my father out, but I know that if I push my father out, it will give me a bad reputation among the businessmen. So the best thing to do is to grow into someone who could take over the business and just, leave my father in the background. He'll die eventually anyway. So he does exactly what his father always wanted him to do in the first place, which is grow into the business that he wanted him to take. He wants his sisters out of his life. He considers killing them, but realizes it would probably just be easier if he helps them get married off. So that's what he does. And on it goes. Until eventually he is going to marry a girl, but he is infatuated with another girl and actually has designs to rape her. This is like a plot point in the story, but instead prevents another person from raping her, so she marries him. And he insists on waiting until marriage to consummate their relationship, because he knows that if he does that, it will be less likely that she will leave him, and it will get him a better reputation around the town, which will help him in the long term. So
Amazing.
that's the idea behind the story. Finally, at one point, if you could argue that the rape is the worst thing that he nearly goes through with, but he eventually goes to kill his new wife's father because she happens to be rich, and he's
Right.
going to kill her, and he's going to kill her father because he is sick anyway. So he goes, if I kill him, I'll just get the money. But before he does, he offers him the money that he was looking for to open up a new building, and he realizes that if he kills him now, that's more of a risk, and he's going to get the money anyway. So now the calculus has changed, and it makes more sense to keep him alive. So he knocks the poison away. And the book ends with him finally going to France and meeting the author of that book, of the book that was reviewed. And the author, as it turns out, he says he was a huge disappointment. As it turns out, he was just like an old cranky lecher. And he goes, and that's when I realized that, like, clearly, just knowing the principles was not enough. You had to actually be superior enough to delay your gratification long enough that you personally could advance and to a higher state. Like that he knew enough to know that you should be putting yourself first, but he did not have the self-control to actually do what was best for himself in every circumstance. But I did, and that makes me the wickedest man in the world.
Amazing.
So, the joke of the book is like, look at the horrible crimes he commits. Like helping his sisters get married. Talking a man out of killing himself and convincing him to give up alcohol. And then it's just various things of that nature. Now, as far as the book goes, it is amusing. You could tell the joke is funny.
Right.
But
And
there
it sounds
was
cleverly told.
What was that?
And it sounds very cleverly told.
It is. It's a very clever book. There is, though, something that did make me wonder, because I'm not sure, like, if it made the point it was trying to make exactly, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, obviously, the point that Bully was making in the satire was that if you were a truly self-interested man, in fact, the way of Christian living is, in fact, the best way to live your life, right? Like,
Right.
that's the theory he's trying to push. And
which isn't wrong either.
It's not wrong exactly, but here's where I question where he's going with this. On 2 occasions, something happens that makes an actually wicked thing that he would have done would have been, for him in that situation, the best thing to do. The rape of the girl's name, I think, was Amelia. The rape of Amelia, that just so happens there was somebody else who was also going to do it, and he prevents it. And the murder of Amelia's father. In those 2 cases, as it turned out, in those specific circumstances, it ended up being better for Galahad to help those people instead, right?
Right.
But that was through pure coincidence. Like, if there was nobody else there, he was absolutely right in saying that by all counts, committing an untraceable crime and getting the lust out of my system before I got married would have been a perfectly rational, reasonable, and entirely self-interested thing for me to do. And I have absolutely no regrets on, like, the fact that I almost did this. Like, if anything, the thing that I am ashamed of is that I hesitated on it for too long before then. Yeah. Like, and he is right. But by all accounts, what he says is correct. Same thing with killing Amelia's father. It ends up in the story that keeping him alive ends up being the better idea. But that is almost due to coincidence or happenstance. Like, if he had, if the father hadn't changed his mind and he had killed him, that would have been a perfectly rational, reasonable, self-interested thing to do that would have worked out for the best for him. So I guess what I'm saying is, just by virtue of those 2 worst things he did, only really ended up not being right? Like, not.
Right.
It only ended up being not the right thing to commit something truly wicked through a complete coincidence. And I'm wondering if that's like, what is the point Bully is making there? I guess is what I'm wondering.
I
I'm
mean, the
not
guy's
saying it's,
unsaved. Like it's.
yeah, like I'm not saying
Oh, so how about this? It's God protecting the people around him from an absolute psychopath.
right. And so here's the thing though, like Galahad, you say like he's unsaved, and yes, and Galahad would delightfully tell you this. And then he would mock you for your belief in heaven and
Oh,
hell. Uh but with that said, like when his father does die, he admits to actually being very upset over it, and he says he was actually annoyed that he was upset over it. So there's something in Galahad that isn't totally gone, right?
yes.
Uh, I guess that's what I'm wondering though. Like, what I'm wondering is, what is Bolli trying to say with those two uh, circumstances? Because I'm not really sure. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, I don't really know what the point he's making is. Is he trying to say that the wicked are only not wicked, like you said, because God is preventing them from doing the worst that they could do? Is he trying to say that, like, in most situations, Christian morality is just going to be the best thing anyway? I don't really know. And I'm not sure. I'm wondering, too, if I'm asking the wrong questions. Because it could be that Bully is just trying to be funny. And it is funny.
Oh yeah.
Like, it made me laugh. Uh, of course, like, it makes you laugh in a meta way, right? It's more
Right.
like it makes you laugh after the fact as you think over what you just read. Like, again, like, the meta joke of the book is that it's called The Crimes of Galahad, and I am pretty sure Galahad does not commit a single crime. Like, I
Yeah.
actually don't think he does anything illegal in the story.
Sounds about
And in
right.
fact, he behaves with like perfect Christian compunction. Perhaps the idea is the difference between works and faith. I have no clue. Uh, like I'm not totally sure what the point Bully is making, and I suspect that if I asked him, he would not tell me. So, you know,
Right.
he would give some sort of I'm trying to think of the word, eclectic answer or
Hmm.
mysterious answer,
Right.
and he would not tell me. And perhaps that is as it should be.
I mean,
Either way, the book is recommended.
the idea that people could be preserved from other people's evil, I think, is a perfectly reasonable interaction of God with other people. Like, how many Christian families have been supported by the Rockefellers having a big business? But, hmm,
Well, yeah. I'm thinking it over. Like,
yeah. No, it's worth thinking over.
The Crimes of Galahad is definitely a very interesting book. Like, I think that the larger point that Bully was trying to make, if I had to get, and again, like, I suspect if I asked him, he would give an intentionally obtuse answer. Like, I don't think he would, I think he would go, like, I'm sure you can figure it out, Uh, But like I suspect that the point of the Crimes of Galahad was that if you were a truly self-interested man who really was the master of their passions and emotions, then you would act as the perfect Christian gentleman. Because that is the thing that is most likely to get you the best things out of your life. I'm just wondering what those two incidents are, going by that theory of the book, right? Like,
Mm.
working off of that theory of the meaning of the book, I'm wondering what those two incidents have to say about it. Because they would appear to indicate that in that moment, a truly wicked man would be justified in doing something absolutely awful, uh, except that circumstance and kismet prevented it. perhaps though that's missing the point, right? Bully
Right.
is saying that most of the time you would act as a Christian, meaning that most people who promote these theories, who are pathologically unhealthy individuals, like the author of the book that he meets at the end, Boucher,
Mm-hmm.
or think of Nietzsche,
Yes.
right? As an excellent example of this, actually. Uh, Most of these people, these are not the people you should be listening to, right?
I mean, I guess it's different for it's. I've
You can
never.
see,
Hold
by
on.
the way, the book is worth talking about, right?
Oh, it is. It absolutely is, and I'm kind of interested in reading it myself. But the thing with it is that the the importance of Nietzsche, and this is the only real importance of Nietzsche that a Christian must learn, is that he warned of our times, the times that we are living in now. In 100 years, it is very likely that Nietzsche will have no real place. I don't really agree with anyone in our circles who say that he was just a madman. When he describes the undermen, I don't see some weird, Nazi propaganda piece. I see the people getting drunk in my bar Friday and Saturday night. So to me it's a little bit different. But it's how do I want to put it? The misery that living only for yourself brings is less some sort of will to power, but a function of a man saying, I am sufficient within myself. And they will become as sufficient as they are capable of becoming. Galahad lives up to his namesake in the sense of being like the best non-Christian in the world. Who is from the outside, only the outside, indistinguishable from a good Christian man, because I'm sure he goes to church just because it's expected of him. And then you'd have, uh, the author who is a wretch, who probably lived to the sinful heights of his soul, but no more. Hmm. Because
Like, I get,
yeah,
I think with Crimes of Galahad, like, what he would be saying is that, most people who are going to be pushing this sort of philosophy are not the sort of people who could possibly live it because they aren't superior people.
right,
So I suppose what he was trying to do is say, like, I'm going to make my character an actually superior person, at
right,
the very least, who is smart enough to, you know, always act to most rationally in every situation or close to it. And in doing so, demonstrates that Christianity is more rational than hedonistic atheism.
yes,
Yeah. So, which is amusing, don't get me wrong, but there is something to the idea of like most of the time.
mm,
And I wonder if maybe that's part of the point of the story, right? Like, you do need more, like, it brings you a lot, it brings you close, but you do need more if you truly want to live a moral life. Not necessarily the most self-interested life, as Galahad would say, he is a perfectly wicked man, so he's not very interested in that. But if you, the Christian, want to live a perfectly moral life, even if you think that that's the best thing for you, you need to do just a little bit more than that. Because odds are, fate isn't going to hand you chances, on a silver platter like they do to Galahad.
right.
But
I mean, you'd be
that's why
surprised, but yeah,
I'll end it there because I think that that's worth discussing. And Steven says the theory of the book breaks down when viewed in a society that doesn't value good Christian morals. I think that is true, but on the other hand, to be fair though, I think like the theory of the book is that in that society, right? Like I
yes,
don't think it's not like Bully came out and made a statement. It is true in every circumstance. He was discussing like 1800s America,
right,
right?
yeah,
I suspect if Galahad lived nowadays, he would be something like a Hollywood producer. You know,
Yeah, I
but
could
I
see
don't
that.
know for sure. Like, it would be an interesting thought experiment, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's
Uh,
yeah,
anyway, I'll end it there as saying, like, you could clearly see that, like, the very fact that I'm not completely sure what Bully is trying to say with the book is one of the things that makes it worth reading. Like, he's saying something. It's interesting. It's worth talking about. We can have a conversation about it. That's genuinely stimulating. And it is
mm,
funny on its own terms. The joke is good. The
yes,
Crimes of Galahad. He's the wickedest man in the world. Watch him do things such as talk a man out of suicide, help his sisters get married, right? Like,
yes.
make his father rich, make his customers happy, give raises to his employees. And then it's like, and he is truly the wickedest man on earth. It's funny.
Yeah.
So, recommended book. I probably will write something for Castalia House about it one day. And you're up, Ben.
So my next book is An Atlas of Bad Roads by Amisha Burnett. Um, it's a collection of his horror stories. He actually did a stream with us a few months ago about it when it was on Indiegogo, and it was a very good stream, I must say. The kicker is that it's a collection of short stories. It's very quiche. There's a bunch of different ones in there of different types. Pardon me, I'm going to go pick it up.
I have no clue what Ben is doing, so enjoy the background noise of Ben moving.
My bulk. My bulk. Charles de Gaulle, please. No, I'm kidding. Uh, just randomly call upon Charles de Gaulle. I don't know. I was trying to think of somebody. Uh, but the thing is that, like, to actually name somebody living might be libel, so I don't know. Call upon them like they're my slave. I've got somebody chained up to my wall, and they must obey. They must obey, or they get no cheese nips. No cheese nips for you.
Is this the perfectly rational thing for you to do, as Galahad would say?
No, it's not really about rationality with me. It's never been about rationality with me. So here's the thing that drives me crazy. The more rational I act, the less I succeed, and it drives me bonkers. I have no idea why. Like, jobs I take for myself fail, but if somebody says, "Hey Ben, check out here, I'll give you an in," and I go in, I'm more successful. I don't know why. I just don't know. You can't be logical or rational with that kind of life. But whatever. It's neither here nor there. Um just don't think about it, Ben. Just gotta not think about it. So Atlas of Bad Roads. It's set mostly in Missouri and the West. There's some really great pieces in it. He did talk pretty carefully about 227 Progress Loop, which is pretty good. I'm about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm about 7 stories in. Mystery Train, the first story, is my favorite so far, and I think with good reason. It's about a gentleman who is hired by the deceased to watch over his corpse until it reaches a certain place in California. The man, of course, was rich and crazy, and, don't you know it? Uh, but he did have esoteric knowledge, don't you know? Uh, excuse me. And you know, don't let anybody take his corpse. And the guy says, "Yeah, all right. That seems simple enough." And everyone laughs and laughs and laughs. Um, everyone just laughs. Yeah, absolutely. It's gonna be easy. Of course, somebody comes to dispute the body, And because this man has prayed over the body, it is under his power to give the body of the tycoon to uh, the witch, or to keep it for himself, or perhaps worse than witch. It's good. It's a good man, or a somewhat good man, rejecting evil, which I think is always a great story. There's a few others. 227 Progress Road is about a guy who's surveying a shopping mall, and uh, he gets involved with some cannibals, some Mad Max style cannibals, as you do, as you do. Misha Burnett's language and use of poetry to start off all the stories is excellent and whets the appetite. I actually found I could move more easily from short story to short story with the poems in between. And I might experiment with it myself, to try and see what is going on there, and whether is there anything I can sort of use for myself. Um, it is something to carefully consider for sort of anthology series. This is one of the better ones from a single author who isn't somebody like John C. Wright or Larry Correa. Uh, a lot of people have stories, and sometimes they're just not good, but they want to include them and they want them to be earning money. Well, that's fine and all, but quite frankly, ain't nobody got time for that. So I like it that all the stories so far have been very readable. One of them in particular, Black Dog, was very readable, but it was very bitter. It was a very bitter story. Uh, I'll actually get an Amazon link. Hold on, just because it is worth reading. It's definitely worth reading. Um, Hail Lord
So
Amazon,
while you're looking
Amazon,
that up, I just
Amazon.
very briefly, uh, I am very careful about reviewing things from like other superversive authors, and I don't promise reviews publicly anymore because I won't lie in a like I'm going to give, if I give a review, it's going to be an accurate review. But ever since, so this happened after I dealt with a book by, and I can mention this because it was published and this all already happened. Roll Nianzi.
Hmm.
Uh, he had a book. I can't remember the title of it, but it was from years ago, and it was about like an anime girl with powers who teams up with a Puritan to fight like through the underworld or something. Uh, I didn't think it was very good, and I wrote a review of it, and I said as much, and I got like attacked for it. People were mad that I wrote a bad review, and at first I was like, like what are you, I just gave an accurate review, but in retrospect, I actually kind of agree with them, and that's why like Royal Nianzi, basically, he was a new and up and coming writer who had supposedly, from people who I knew read him, this was actually a major improvement, right? Like on
Hmm.
the last thing that he'd written. And I had just publicly said, like, don't buy his stuff, you know. And this is not from a major publisher. This is not somebody who could really bear that sort of negative criticism. This is somebody who was trying to sell their work. So I was like, you know what? I actually think you're right. I will no longer write bad reviews of people that I know. Now, that is not to say I will ever lie in a review. I simply won't review something if I don't like it. So I am very careful not to promise people reviews anymore.
Hmm.
Like, if I publicly promise a review, then like you're gonna have to accept the fact that it might not be good, and I don't want to do that. So what I'm saying is the fact that you're talking about Misha's book, I'm glad you like it.
No, no. Here's the key of it. I endorse it. I endorse Misha's work. Um, honestly, for stuff I don't like, I don't review it. There's nothing else to it. I will review somebody's bad work if they make themselves obnoxious to me. because it's like, okay, you're gonna make this an issue. You're gonna step up to me. All right, I'll start punching. This is it. This is why there's some things that have come up I just haven't mentioned. There's a certain author's books who sells very well, but each book has been shorter than the last, and it's actually affected the story. It affected the story very much. It made it very unsatisfying for me. And I am somebody who has paid a lot of money into his Indiegogos. A lot of money, more money than I should have. So you can understand that there's sort of things to it. There's a balance to it. The stories are great, but there's been, like, you can literally measure them with your eyes and say each story has been shorter than the one before. Now, I don't know whether that's creator burnout, or he's got more important things to do, or what. Um, and there's criticism there to have, especially since I'm the one who's paying money. But also, there's a certain amount of responsibility from, authors to each other to not be publicly critical of allies. Raul Nianzi is an ally. He's been very friendly to us. I don't enjoy his work, but at the same time, I'm never going to say a cross word. The man tries. The man's one of the hardest working superversives. He's got some really out there ideas that I think people could enjoy, and people do enjoy them. So it's one of those things. We actually do have an interview with Raul Nianzi somewhere on here that you can certainly look up and find. Um, if you're interested more in his work. A dollar to him is not a dollar wasted to Disney. Let's be real. That's as big a draw as anything else for a lot of this stuff. But if you have only $5 this week to give, I do recommend An Atlas of Bad Roads by Amisha Burnett, without anything. But this is a sort of review, so I'm going to review it, or at least the ones I've found interesting enough to review. And the one I guess I'll focus on, like I've already said. Let me pull up the table of contents again, because I got the physical book. Mystery Train. What was Dead Man? Oh yeah, Mystery Train was very good. Black Dog was good but bitter. 227 Progress Loop was good. What was? I can't for some. There's one story that's like escaping my mind.
I wouldn't know. I haven't read the book.
Wow, Anthony. Wow, you're reviewing it and you haven't even read it?
I'm not reviewing it.
Is it? Oh, right. This is interesting. I'm not sure what to make of it, though. Burn Silent, Burnt Bright is. I'm not sure what to make of that, honestly. But it's an interesting story. It's got interesting ideas to it. And it's certainly worth sort of reading for yourself. Uh, yeah. Not much else to that one. I think I'll have more to think about once I've read all of it, but so far I haven't had anything that stops me, that makes me go, ugh, that makes me, want to put it down and stop reading. The only reason I stopped reading is because the sun was setting and I had to go do something. I was reading it in a park, you see. Cordell says, I read the brief overview of Cuchulainn. Very interesting Irish lore. Eldritch Fan shows up and says, sup, what I miss? Oh, we're just reviewing books. Couple fiction, couple non-fiction. I don't really have much else to say about An Atlas of Bad Roads. If you want to take over for another one, Anthony.
So, here's a question. I'm on to non-fiction then at this point, meaning, do you want me to talk about The Eighth Arrow yet, or wait?
We'll do that last.
Sure, I don't know how close we are to the end. Okay, then I'll do one of the nonfiction books that I read relatively recently. So I have a few picks here, but I'm going to because I read a few different nonfiction books. I'll pick The Case for Jesus by Brant Petra. Brant Petra is absolutely my favorite theologian right now. The case for Jesus is not the case for Christ. So that's actually important because the case for Christ is quite famous. It was made into a movie, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And it was by I think a lawyer named Lee Strobel who tried to investigate Jesus from a lawyer's point of view. Brant Petra is not Lee Strobel. He is a theologian. Specifically, he's a Catholic theologian, but the case for Jesus isn't a Catholic book. He does have Catholic books. The case for Jesus is not one of them. It is just about, why should you believe in Jesus? And here is what I really liked about this book. What really, really impressed me about it. I absolutely love Petra's writing, and what impressed me about the case for Jesus is that it occurred to me that the case that he was making in this book is precisely what the early Christians were convinced by, why they believed in Jesus. Here is what I mean. He starts off by establishing what he believes to be the historical reliability of the Gospels, and he does this by talking about various arguments against them and pointing out that they're really honestly dishonest, right? So, for example, there is this idea that the Gospels were originally written anonymously. And according to Petra, he goes, this is completely not, this is not only wrong, it is completely nonsense. We literally do not have a single copy of the Gospels that is attributed anonymously. Not one. They are all attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah. Every single version that we have. The only copies of the Gospels we have that are not attributed by name to the four evangelists are fragments. That is it. So that's one thing where he goes, people who say that, particularly Bart Ehrman, who is the leading, quote-unquote historical Jesus scholar, people who say that the Gospels were written anonymously and it only had names attached to them later, he says they're just lying at that point. And he goes, and it's even more than that, because he goes, let's assume that you could go, okay, they were written anonymously, but all the copies we have are the ones with names. And he goes, I want you to consider what is more likely, that everybody always knew who they were written by, or that four random names just so happened to be applied all across the, Roman Empire, essentially, from, Asia to the Middle East to Europe, and they all got the same names appended to them at roughly the same times, completely coincidentally, with no exceptions. Mark was never attributed to Luke. Matthew was never called the Gospel of Peter. And he's like, what is more likely? He's like, it beggars belief. So, you get the four Gospels. He goes, now, who wrote the Gospels? And he goes through, we have very good reason to believe that the traditional authorship view of the Gospels is real, right? So, he goes through, first, Mark. Who is Mark, right? And he go, well, Mark, a lot of people don't realize this. I didn't until he said it. I had, obviously read the verses, but it didn't click in my head till he pointed it out. And I went, oh, wow, you're right. Mark is mentioned in the New Testament, by name. He is in Acts of the Apostles. He has an argument with Paul.
Yep.
And he's like, so we have very good reason to believe them there. We also have reason to believe that Mark was probably an eyewitness to the events because he tells the story of the man. I forget the exact incident at the time he was talking about, but Jesus is being talked to by centurions, and there is a man in a loincloth, and the centurions and the Romans grab him by the loincloth, but the man gets away. And they said, why is this story even included? It's so random and it doesn't seem to add anything. Well, it makes sense if you realize or you consider the idea that perhaps the reason the story is included is that that person is Mark. And he is making it clear that he was an eyewitness to the events of at least some of the events of the Gospels, right?
Right.
So, and he was a companion of Paul. Go ahead.
So the one that's held to in my Protestant circles anyway, is that after he had an argument with Paul, he worked with Peter for a bit, and
yes.
Peter is his gospel. Though we don't have any particular opinion as to whether Mark was actually there or was a young man who was picked up, to serve in the ministry, which often happens, like with Timothy and Titus.
Oh yeah, I'm not. So remember, this is Petra presenting this as like a case. I don't really know for sure if that's him, but I find that very plausible. And he does say like Mark almost certainly worked with Peter, and he's like again the historical record for this. He's like people will say that there's a very sparse historical record, and that's just not true. Like there isn't. We actually, it's very well attested that essentially the Gospel of Mark is the apostle of Peter. Right, like it's the idea. Now, there admittedly are two traditions. One tradition is Peter was alive when the gospel was finished and read it and recommended it. And there's one tradition that he was dead when the gospel was finished, and we don't really know which one is true. But that's, like almost besides the point. The point is that both confirm that Mark was like essentially Peter's secretary.
Yes.
So Luke, of course, is one of the most well attested because he tells us a lot about himself, and he appears in letters from Paul as well. So we have attestation outside of Lucan sources, right? We know that Luke must have been able to write because doctors would have had to be able to write for prescription purposes and things like that. So that makes sense. We know that Luke tells us how he wrote his gospel. Like he is one of the more clear about it. He interviewed eyewitnesses.
Yep.
Interestingly, I've always found that we have very good evidence that Luke probably interviewed Mary, and we know this for two reasons. First is that there are incidents about the childhood of Jesus that appear in Luke that don't appear in any other gospel. And second, and arguably more conclusively, I would think more conclusively, there is a story where Mary says that she kept all of these things in her heart. So how did Luke know that? Well, he would have had to talk to Mary. And this makes perfect sense if Luke did as he said, which is interview eyewitnesses.
Yep.
So we have the historical reliability of Luke. We have Matthew. Again, the fact that Matthew was a tax collector and an apostle, this is attributed, like the early church is very clear. They don't attribute the gospel to any other Matthew. Like there is no there is no confusion over who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. It is well attested that Matthew was written by the apostle of Jesus. And again, it actually makes sense because Matthew, as a tax collector, would have had to know how to write, to record, who was giving what money. So also there is a focus on money in Matthew's gospel, which indicates that it was somebody who knew something about it. And it's just easier to say, like, well, then it's probably the guy who everybody says wrote it, who we know was a tax collector.
Right.
And then finally you get to John, and I would argue that John is one of the tested, even though it was written last, because John was alive for so long. Like, there were people who could confirm Johannan authorship, right? And again, like, we don't have any competing traditions here. That's the real key that Petra's getting at in the book. Like, there is no, it could have been this guy, could have been that guy. And he's like, let's consider a case where there's a book in the Bible, in the New Testament, in fact, that actually is anonymous. Hebrews. And he goes, in Hebrews, we do have, like, contested authorship. Most people say Paul, but not everyone. There's also a Barnabas tradition.
Yep.
There is I think that right now there's a scholarly theory that Luke actually wrote Paul or Hebrews, which is interesting and I haven't heard before, but it's plausible. I don't see why not.
It's
like
doesn't match.
There's a Barnabas
style,
tradition, a Timothy tradition surrounding Hebrews, and he's like, that's an actual anonymous work, right?
Yeah.
Like, we don't know who wrote it. But with John and the other three Gospels, we get none of that. It is always attributed to the Apostle John.
Mm-hmm.
And they go, now, John was illiterate, we know. They said, but there are two things to say here. First, he was illiterate at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. When John wrote that Gospel, who knows what he had learned? And second, he probably had a secretary. Like, in fact, that was very, very common. We know for a fact that Peter did. I don't remember if John mentions it or not. He might have. But we know for a fact that Peter had a secretary, so it is totally plausible that John had a secretary and he dictated the book. And
Yep.
it's plausible that he just learned how to write. Yeah, like,
Yeah.
it's really not that, it's not that complicated. It's also possible illiterate might not mean couldn't read. It could just have meant that he was not a scholar. Yeah,
Yeah.
we don't know. Uh, the point is that we have absolutely no reason to believe it was by John. And then this wasn't in. I'm now getting outside of the review of Petra's book, but once you get into like the Essene community and the traditions surrounding the Essene community, you realize that a lot of the supposed unique Johannine touches are actually like from the Essene community, which is interesting. Uh, the point being that the case for Jesus, it really does a good job of establishing that, like, it's not so much proves that the gospels are real as that, like, there is absolutely no reason to doubt them. Any reason that you give to doubt the gospels is like basically because you have a bias against Christianity, because any other historical text with this amount of attestation with no competing claims you would just accept as the product of that
Right.
author. It's not a proof of it per se, but it's like there's no disproof, so what are you arguing with?
Right.
And then here's what's really interests me too. What he moves on from there is like, what does Jesus claim about this? And what he gets into, and this is why I said what I really liked about the case for Jesus, is that it's what the early Christians believed. So, like, why did they believe Jesus was the Son of God? And Petra gets into it. Well, because Jesus, or in the Messiah. First, he gets into why they believed he was the Messiah, and the answer is because Jesus was fulfilling prophecies, like, to the year. Like, the prophecies he was fulfilling, he goes, what you need to understand about that era is that they were looking at a prophecy from the book of Daniel that talked about 4 empires, and the fourth empire was widely believed at the time to be Rome. So at the time when Jesus appeared, the Jews were waiting for the Messiah to show up at that time.
Yep.
Like, very specifically, that was the point that they had predicted from the book of Daniel, the Messiah would arrive. And that is when Jesus showed up. And they said, and even more than that, he goes, it gets absolutely stunning to the point of like awe-inspiring when you get into, in Daniel, the death of the Messiah is predicted. And if you like time it out to years, like the supposed year that Daniel took place, claims to have taken place, to the year that the crucifixion happened, it is down to the year, the prediction of the crucifixion. Like, it is dead on to the point where it's like eerie. It's honestly awe-inspiring how accurate the prophecy is. And then he
Yeah.
goes into various other prophecies that Jesus supposedly fulfilled. And he's going like, you have to remember that like these aren't like prophecies that you get like in the modern day or like Nostradamus prophecies. These are very specific prophecies that are dated, that Jesus is fulfilling precisely when they said they would be fulfilled. And that is exactly what they're saying too. And also, we have good reason to believe that like he rose from the dead. If you look at the very first sermon that Peter preaches, it's like he basically skips over the life to go, also he rose from the dead, and we're sure of this.
Yep. And now keep in mind that, like, when he was talking to people, everyone knew who Jesus was. Everyone knew what was going on. Many of them were there at the crucifixion or his torture. Like like the benefit that Peter had was that everything was public knowledge. This is what everyone was talking about. They were talking about Jesus Christ. And so they probably even heard him preach. Like one of the things, there's a fellow who was lame since birth, and he was always standing at the temple door and had been all his life. That means that Jesus passed by this guy and didn't heal him, but he was healed by Jesus's apostles, or it is likely that Jesus passed by and didn't heal him, and they heal him. Then everyone could see it, everyone could talk about it. It's
Right.
like it's one of those things where everyone involved took it as truth, And even the Roman records that we do have of that time just sort of goes, yeah, this is what happened.
So, yeah, what I would say too, so Petra's approach is first the gospel, establish the gospels are historically reliable. Then move on after building that block, going from there. What do the gospels claim? And then go, well, if you take the gospels as historically reliable, which we should, and I do, then you start to see that Jesus was started fulfilling prophecies at that point to the year, very specific named prophecies with timelines that Jesus was explicitly fulfilling, and he was making predictions that were coming true within the lifetime of the people there. And then finally he says the last thing we need to look at is why did people believe that Jesus was God? And he says, and I'm going, obviously he's looking at what's sometimes called the synoptic problem, and he's going, that it's not as explicit in the synoptic gospels. He says, I contend that it's actually quite clear in the synoptic gospels. I mean, John, everybody acknowledges that John makes it clear. But
Yes.
he goes, I would contend that it is quite clear in the synoptic gospels as well. Goes, first, you need to give the claims that Jesus is God the same courtesy that you give to claims he was the Messiah. Everybody admits and everybody knows that Jesus was not as explicit about claiming he was the Messiah. Because he knew that, people were going to have trouble accepting it. He would have trouble with the Jewish authorities, right? And they go, and yet, people wonder, but then why wasn't he explicit about the fact that he was God? And go, you really don't think that wouldn't have been more radical? And Petra makes a few points here. He goes, for one thing, he claims he was God to Caiaphas. And he's like, and if you don't believe me, he goes, I have a question for you. Why was Jesus executed? He's like, seriously, he goes, I never see people, historians specifically, I never see them ask this question. If Jesus did not claim that he was God, then why was he executed? Right?
Yeah.
And he goes, Caiaphas is very clear that's exactly why he was executed.
Yep.
It's like, this is not, this isn't as hidden as people are saying, is the point.
Yes.
And he goes, and then the other reason is that people like Bart Ehrman just discount the miracles as part of the, they go, well, the miracles didn't happen. And he goes, which is clear question begging. Once you take the miracles into account, the case becomes a lot more clear. And he goes, Jesus is saying that he's God in an elliptical way. For example, there's the calming of the storm, and there's that, one of the most famous lines of the Gospels, who is this man that the winds and sea obey him? Come on, that's not that subtle.
Right.
Right?
To me, it's even a shock, that,
yeah.
People question it. Why in the world would you question that? He's explicit all the way through. He's like, today the prophecy is fulfilled in me, after one particular thing where he reads from Isaiah, which is generally taken to be the prophecies about him. To me, it's very strange, and I blame academics. I blame the Longhouse.
Yeah.
I blame the demons that lie in the Venus of Wittendorf.
I think I would argue the most explicit of all is the healing of the paralytic, because
Yes.
literally in the healing of the paralytic, honestly, The Chosen did this scene, by the way, so well. For the record, I absolutely love the way that they did it. It made it come alive in a very good way, but. He literally, stares the Pharisees down, looks them in the eye, and goes, so you don't think I can forgive sins? And he's like, okay, so what's easier, to just say your sins are forgiven, or to tell a paralytic that he can walk now? And then he goes, basically, walk home. And the paralytic does. Come on, that's very clear what's going on, He is telling them without telling them. He is speaking in Jewish riddles, as he does with a lot of what he does, because, again, for the same reason, he wouldn't have clearly claimed he was the Messiah. In fact, more of a reason. He wants people to know, but he wants to say it in such a way that he's only going to be arrested when, the prophecy's time has come to be fulfilled, right?
And even then,
He's
did try to
timing
kill
everything
him.
very carefully.
Yes.
So that's my review of the book. I think that it's a really clever approach. he doesn't put it that way, but it struck me as like this is exactly. I'm sorry, I missed one last argument that he made, which is important actually. The last argument that he makes is honestly the simplest of all. The fact that Christianity happened was itself a prophecy fulfilled. He says the early church is extremely clear about this. There were prophecies in the Old Testament, very clear ones, that the Jewish God would be worshipped by the Gentiles, and then the Roman Empire converted. He's like, this itself, like the early church is incredibly clear. This is itself a proof of Christianity. And he says, and I really want you to consider, if you were reading that prophecy as a Jew in the 1st century when Jesus was first appearing, it would have seemed like nonsense to you. It would have seemed completely unthinkable. And then it happened within 100 years, within 300 years.
Yep.
Right? Like, Gentiles started worshiping the God of the Jews. Like, think about that for a moment, how insane that is.
Yeah.
Eldritch Fan says, I hear folks argue, well, why didn't all this happen in the age of mass communications? And we'd see it on the internet and know it's true. I look around and think, would it have made a difference? Well, I mean, my thought on that argument is we literally, like, have billions and 6 billion Christians or something? I might be undershooting it. 2 billion?
No, it's like, so, how about this? Supposedly, there are
2-something billion Christians in the world?
Hold on. No. There are 2-something billion people who claim to be Christian.
Right.
Yes.
That's what I'm trying. Yeah, I understand the distinction. The point being, though, like, I think what the plan that he had worked. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've never understood that argument, because I'm like, so are you saying that you don't know about what happened? In which case, are you saying that the internet would have made you know about it more?
Oh boy,
like,
I can't wait for Jesus's next TikTok. Supposedly he's gonna heal a leper.
Honestly, a TikTok of Jesus healing a leper now is a very funny concept. And then he just stares into the camera and winks.
And then
the leper gets up and dances. Everybody starts debating about whether it's photoshopped.
The ADL starts suing him for being anti-Semitic.
It's like, I'm Jewish, right? And they completely ignore it. So at 8:43, do you want me to talk about the 8th arrow a bit?
Let me
you want to say something first, and then we can end it a little later. It's okay.
Let me just. I'm just gonna be 5 minutes.
Take your time.
Not even 5 minutes. So one of the books I'm reading is a history of the history of the Gothic novel. The one I have it was republished in 1962, but it was back in 1932 when it was originally posted. And it's basically, I'm still working through the first chapter because nonfiction is just laboriously slow for me. But the idea is interesting that the Gothic novel comes directly from the English romance novel, which I think is fairly undeniable. However, there is a certain amount of Englishness that, sort of runs through it. Every major Gothic novel has originally been English or English sourced, or if it was written by, say, a German, from their natural myths into the English style. And it's always a bit more depressing for some reason. There are a couple Italians and whatnot who write interesting novels, but it's not quite the same. It's like how science fiction claims Frankenstein as its first grandsire, but in reality there were, science fiction novels all the way back to Rome to a point, though really it's more science fantasy or space fantasy. It's the thing that kind of gets me that I want to talk about and I've been thinking about is that it talks a lot about the passing fads of romance novels that are dead by the time the author was writing their book, the book that I'm reading now. And to me, it just sort of like reinforces the idea that as the Gothic novels were, so were the pulps, so are the YA novels we have now, and so will whatever we write in the future. Cyberpunk was relevant, and now it's barely relevant. You know, I recently bought Cyberpunk 2077 because it was super cheap. It's probably going to be garbage because it's supposedly not that great, but its aesthetic and ideas survive. But nobody can really talk about it or produce it like William Gibson could because it has moved past itself, and our world has moved past itself into something more, something stranger, and maybe even worse. Um, and I just think that there's some ideas there that people of the past were wise enough to understand, even if they were like, yeah, I still like romance novels, deal with it. I still like pulps. But I think the documentation of it is important, and I'll probably do a longer form video when it's ready to go. Go for it, Anthony.
Fantastic. So, the last thing that we're going to discuss today, because we have a surprise announcement regarding this
And I'm
that I'll
scared.
mention at the end.
I'm so scared, Anthony,
Ben's terrified.
because
And you should be. No.
bad things happen, Anthony. Bad things happen.
No, seriously, though, it's a great book. So, I love this book so much. I read it in 2 days, and it was not that short. And I read it in 2 days. And then I posted the first review of it on Castalia House that I have in months. And this book is called The Eighth Arrow, and it's by Father J. Augustine Weta. And let me tell you, this is better than any of the other books that I've mentioned, fiction-wise. Non-fiction's its own category, obviously. But it's better than The Hiker's Guide to Purgatory. It is better than The Crimes of Galahad. It was honestly, it blew me away how good it was. So, the plot of The Eighth Arrow is that it takes place in the world of Dante's Inferno. And the book is about Odysseus, and Odysseus is in hell. Specifically in the underworld of Dante's Inferno. When one day, after 3,000 years of suffering in the realm of liars, Odysseus sees two people appear and ask him how he got there, and he answers. The implication, of course, though Odysseus doesn't know this, is that these two people are Dante and Virgil. Now, as they walk away, Odysseus notices footprints on the ground, and he realizes that Dante must be alive. Figuring then that must mean that that for some reason, at this point, the living are permitted into the Inferno. He begs Athena Parthenos for help, claiming that if he'd ever meant anything to her in life, then to please help him now, and he'll serve her. And the Parthenos shows up in front of him and his friend Diomedes, who was his companion in the Trojan War.
Absolute
and she
Chad.
What was that?
Absolute Chad.
He was. And she frees them, but then says, I don't know why you expect me to help you. You clearly deserve to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And Odysseus goes, yeah. It's
Yeah.
but please. And then she's like, okay, tell you what, I'll give you a quest. And he's like, and don't worry, it is possible for you to accomplish. He goes, if you can map your way through all of the circles of hell, then I will let you go. And he goes, you need to learn, but before you go, he goes, you need to choose mercy over justice, and you must fire the eighth arrow. And Odysseus has no idea what this means, because though she has given him and Diomedes their armor back, along with a mysterious bag which has something in it which they do not know, he doesn't know what she means when she says the eighth arrow, since she has only gifted them with 7. And what follows from this point is Odysseus' attempt to break out of the underworld. Essentially. Now, I absolutely love this book. I was blown away with how clever it was. I'm going to state right off the bat, in defense of Father Weta here, that he is very well aware that what he is writing is not an accurate Christian portrayal of the underworld, nor does he intend it to be. He says so very explicitly, both at the beginning and the end of the book. He's like, for one thing, the very concept of anybody visiting the underworld doesn't make metaphysical sense. And he goes, and even if it did, you couldn't escape if you were there. He's like, but let's tell a story. Yeah. And let me tell you, it is a very good story. I particularly like Father Weta. First off, it is an effortlessly funny book. Some of the lines in the book honestly made me laugh out loud. So Odysseus, when they start, for example, Odysseus has a line where he's like, let me try and find the quote, because I actually put this quote on the blog. And he goes, Diomedes was silent a while longer while I strained at my sword. Then he drew a deep breath. On the rare occasions when he contradicted me, it always began with a deep breath. Odysseus, he said, I followed you around the world and back, and all that time I never doubted your judgment. I nodded. Look where it got us. He had a point. Like, there are lines sort of like that throughout. I really like how Odysseus is characterized. He refers to Diomedes and him as friends, but he clearly resents Diomedes, because even though Odysseus is the cleverer of the two of them, everybody likes Diomedes more, because Odysseus has a reputation as a liar and a thief and a pirate, which are all well-deserved, and he knows it. So it's partially because I'm the smart one, yet everybody, and I'm better spoken than Diomedes even, yet everybody still likes him more. And also the fact that he knows deep down that Diomedes is a better man than he is, and that it's his fault that Diomedes is there, and he resents that. But I really like that a lot of this, for a lot of the story, is in the background. I also like a lot of the really subtle theology in it. For example, Athena tells him when she meets them that you don't even know my true name. And Diomedes and Odysseus actually debate this at several points. Like, was that even really Athena? Could we trust this person? So occasionally in the story, Odysseus will call on the name of Athena. He'll go, I'm here in the name of the goddess Athena, let me through. And literally the demons of the underworld will laugh at him. They'll be like, Athena's name has absolutely no power here, and, you know, we're not taking that seriously. But at different times, Odysseus will say, I call on the Parthenos. Now, he won't do this intentionally, he just sometimes has a habit of referring to Athena as the Parthenos. Parthenos is Greek for the Virgin, and whenever he calls upon the Parthenos, all of the demons are terrified. I really, really like this detail. I liked it because he does not state this at any point in the story, right? He never translates Parthenos. I had to look it up. I didn't even know for sure. I had a suspicion because I knew that Athena was a virgin goddess.
Your Catholic senses were tingling, as it were.
That too, right? And I knew Athena was a virgin goddess, so I thought, does Parthenos just mean like virgin? So when I looked it up, I really, really like this because Odysseus doesn't make the connection at any point in the story. He never says, when I call her the Virgin, people notice, but not Athena. No, it just sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, and Odysseus never really knows why. Which makes sense, right? Odysseus wouldn't make that connection. Like, he has no idea who Jesus is. He doesn't know who the Virgin. Yeah.
Probably doesn't know who the Jews are. Like, it's just...
Right, exactly. Unless, of course, he was Spartan. No. That's an inside joke from...
it is.
If you read the book of Maccabees, you'll note that there's a connection between Jews and Spartans, maybe, kind of, sort of.
It's so
anyway,
weird, though. I just don't get it.
I'm gonna move on. Anyway, but I really like that about the story, that connection is there if you pay attention, but it's never made explicit, and Odysseus doesn't pick up on it. And of course he wouldn't, because there's no reason for him to pick up on it. It just looks like, some demons are afraid of Athena and some aren't, right?
Right.
And he doesn't really know why. And alternatively, there is a bread that they're given at one point, and you could already probably guess if you were a Christian what bread is a reference to. Yeah. But one thing that I really like is that they never come out and say what the bread is supposed to be. Athena does not come and tell him. An angel does not tell him. Instead, people just react to it in different ways. And Odysseus kind of works out eventually that there's something weird about this bread. Right? Like,
Right.
you immediately, I'm sure, when I said bread, Christian connections, Dante's Inferno, underworld, demons are afraid of it, you know what it is.
Yes.
But Odysseus does not. And he wouldn't.
Right.
He has no idea what it is. I love that. I love that they don't make it explicit, that it's just there for the people who are paying attention. And there's lots of stuff like this. Like, there's theological speculation, you know. I think that there's, for example, like, why are they permitted to, you know, is another question to ask. And you could go again, well, they wouldn't be, right? Like, in real, you know, quote unquote, in real life, you're not permitted to leave the hell. Goes, but I think it's still worth it to talk about theological speculation. For example, they talk about, oh, you used to not be able to reach this level of the underworld until the earthquake. And then they talk about, like, what do you mean by the earthquake? And the implication, although, again, it's not directly stated, Chiron is telling him this, the implication is that they are referring to the hallowing of hell. Right? Or the harrowing of hell. That they're referring to when Jesus came in and he, you know, removed the holy souls of limbo, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like, so that's the implication of, like, this was the earthquake they're referring to, and you could arguably speculate that perhaps this offers a chance to the pre-Christian souls who died before Christ. Now, I am not actually making that speculation, to be clear, and I wouldn't. Honestly, that's just in the realm, to me, of stuff we don't know nearly enough about, right? Like,
Right.
I'm sure God has some sort of plan, and whatever it is, it's just. But I think that the theological speculation is interesting to talk about, right? Like,
yes.
Maybe that's why Odysseus, or maybe it's the fact that Athena gives him, or, you know, the virgin, right? The Parthenos gives him the bread that makes him alive again. The dead can't leave, but if you're alive, you could choose, right? And now they're no longer dead. Perhaps that is part of it. And we do know that you can, even though, you know, you have the immediate judgment upon death, we do know that people can be raised from the dead, right? I mean, it happened in the Bible explicitly to Lazarus. And I think that there are at least some plausible post-Jesus, you know, resurrections, and certainly not metaphysically impossible, right?
Yep.
So, given that as a speculative point, I think you could go like, well, maybe he would be still trapped there, but now he's no longer dead, so the will can change in a way that it couldn't before. Again, these are all stuff that none of it's there explicitly. He doesn't tell you what's going on, but you could guess.
Mm-hmm.
And just generally, like, it is... there's a lot of really clever stuff like this in there, right? A lot of clever theological speculation that I think is based off of, if not sound theology, at the very least creative theology, right? Like, creative and interesting fictional application of theology. I'll put it that way. And, you know, once again, I am not saying that Father Weta is actually speculating on this, and because he makes it very clear that he's not, you know, in the book. Like, at the beginning and the end of the book, he makes it very clear that this is entirely meant for fiction. So I'm not accusing him of weird theological speculation, just of crafting a fun story. But I think it's really interesting the way that he does it. I do think, like, I think he takes advantage of the premise in a really good way. Like, you meet everybody that you want to meet, with the sole exception, for some reason, at least in my opinion, of Achilles. He never meets Achilles, and that feels weird to me. Because I feel like that's somebody you would want to meet.
I don't know. To me, it's like, the thing about Achilles is that he's a reminder that earthly glory fades. For who was more glorious than Achilles? But
True, but I mean, you meet everybody, like, right? Like, you meet so many people in here. He meets Penelope again. He meets Homer.
Well, that's a question for him when he comes on.
It Lord is, willing. Yes. Oh. And Ben makes it clear. So, at 9 o'clock, as I spill all of my praise about this, I'm going to stop there because the surprise is that in 2 weeks from today, in fact, we will be meeting with the author, Father J. Augustine Weta, who is a Benedictine monk. He, in fact, lives in St. Louis, Ben. So you're not that far from him. Anyway, Father, I emailed after I read the book. I said I want to see if he's willing to talk to us because there's a lot of interesting stuff too about how he came up with the idea for the book. Apparently, it came from a conversation with Philip Pullman of all people. So,
Right.
which is fascinating and kind of shocking to me, right? Like,
Yeah.
not who I would have guessed. Uh, so I said I'm going to try and get in touch with him, and Father Weta very graciously responded the same day, thanked me for the review, and we made plans to meet with him. So, Father Weta, we will be interviewing about the Eighth Arrow in 2 weeks. He has written a children's book as well and a nonfiction book on the Benedictine habits, I believe. I think it's about like the Benedictine method of forming habit or something like that. I'll have to double check and I'll make sure that we're very clear about all of this stuff by the time we meet him. Get all the ducks in a row.
Yeah.
But his only a novel for adults, I believe, at the moment is The Eighth Arrow. I am sure it's going to be from the email exchange. Father Weta was very pleased that I caught a lot of the references, and I am sure it will be a fascinating discussion. He declined to elaborate on some of my speculations because he wanted to save it for the interview. And I am very, very excited to speak about this with him. I can fanboy about the book with him at the interview, and I am sure it's going to be fascinating to listen to. So please, in 2 weeks, October 9th, clear your schedules because I think he will be a genuinely interesting guest. I know that he does speaking engagements, so I know that he knows how to fill air. Which is sometimes dangerous when you're talking about interviews, right?
Yep.
But I think that Father Weta is going to be a fascinating interview. The book is fascinating. He clearly has a lot of background knowledge to write it. I enjoyed it enough that I think I'll be able to draw out a lot of that background knowledge from him. And I am very, very curious to see what he says about it. So, if you're reading the book currently, as Simon is, I recommend you finish it in by 2 weeks so that you can listen to the whole interview because we're going to be talking about spoilers for things like the end of the story. I already talked about some spoilers here, but they were all minor. We will be talking about spoilers for things like the end of the story and stuff like that. So I highly recommend that you pick up the book and read it. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Ben, I actually think you would enjoy it.
I agree.
So I recommend if you do have time, which you don't, but I know for a fact that you do not have time, but pretending that you do.
I could no, it's I'm trying to make more time for this sort of thing, and I genuinely do want to read more stuff and less sort of like sitting in a stupor after work, which is exhausting and whatnot. It is better for me to read than it is to veg.
That's true. One last thing that I'll mention: the interview with Austin Suggs, Gospel Simplicity. It's not off per se. Austin got ill. Happens. I felt bad. He did not cancel the interview. He seemed open to rescheduling. I'll work it out with him, and once we reschedule, then we'll talk about it. I definitely do want to talk to Austin.
Same.
Anything else, Ben?
No, not at this time. We'll see what we do next week, but we certainly will have some stuff prepared for Father Wit. Is it Father Witta?
Father Weta.
Weta.
Wetta.
Thank you. And yeah, no, just look forward to it. We're going through some things on Pinkerton's Ghosts because life situations have changed somewhat drastically over the last month in ways that I didn't expect, that one of our members didn't expect. and so on and so forth. And I'm
Well,
not.
no, not all of it has been bad, but it's all been a lot.
It's been a lot, and we might have to slow down our Pinkerton's Ghost releases to having a week gap between them. But in return, I'm going to try and work on other things, Pinkerton's related. But I'm gonna make no promises, because I am starting to worry I'm drawing down Nemesis on myself and people around me when I brag on it. Uh, and it sounds so dumb, but it's like, I don't know, my life is weird enough as it is. It's perfectly acceptable. However, we do love you all. I do have.
Yes, and I can assure you we are not giving up on the show by any stretch of the imagination. We're not even stopping our work. The only reason that we're slowing down is because we literally have to.
Right. It is like, we are professionals. We are not some, prissy New York Andy Warhol wannabe. All the Andy Warhol neuroses, none of the Andy Warhol wig. Um, None of the Andy Warhol blank stare. Uh, excuse me. Uh, but we definitely want to, provide content. Uh, as strange and Greek as it is to say, there is glory in using our God-given gifts to bring joy and God's will to this world around us. And I believe writing for everyone involved in Pinkerton's Ghosts is one of the ways that we do that, even beyond our personal witnesses. If we do our jobs right, this will reach out beyond our lives, even to the dusty meme lords who sit in their strange space stations and chart the internet airwaves for ancestral documents of times long past when YouTube was supreme, before the mass mind, before the dark times, before the empire.
Are you
Yeah.
waiting for me to respond? I agree.
No, I was just gonna stare blankly into the future. Uh, somebody's call Tiresias up from hell, and get me his opinions on things. Thank you all for joining us. You are wonderful, and I hope you are pleased with the content we bring soon. Also, look forward to a Halloween stream. We'll have some things recorded, God willing. Have a good one.